The late 1800s was a time of economic growth, of massive development in the United States. It was a time of cities just growing to massive sizes. It was a time of immigrants from different parts of the world flooding into the United States. It was a time when the middle class rose. It was a time when there were tycoons and the rich were getting richer. But it was also a time of poverty for many. It was also a time of discrimination in the South with the Jim Crow laws. This was the Gilded Age. This was the industrialization of the United States of America. Welcome to Lessons in Humanities. For PowerPoints, Google Slides, primary source activities, and other great teaching and learning materials, visit the Lessons in Humanities store. The link to the store is in the description below. After the Civil War and Reconstruction era, the America of the late 1800s was a new America. Mark Twain coined the phrase, the Gilded Age. It was in 1873 he published the novel, The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. The Gilded Age was a period of rapid economic growth and industrial expansion. At the same time, income inequality increased. The new America of the late 1800s included industrialization, rapid growth of cities, big business, new technologies, city slums, influx of immigration, changes in labor, more women were working, there was an expansion of the middle class, the rich were getting richer. The development of a middle class took place. Poverty also was prevalent, wealth inequality. There was also discontent among the workers, and this would, of course, lead to the Progressive Era. There was also the conquering of the West, destruction of independent farming, environmental destruction, and cultural shifts. So this was a time after the Civil War, after or around the end of the Reconstruction. It was from the Gilded Age turning into the Progressive Era. To understand the late 1800s in the United States, let's look at Chicago. Growth in Chicago reflected a national trend in the late 1800s for the whole country. Chicago was a dichotomy of extravagance and filth, money and poverty. It was the gateway city. It connected agricultural goods with capital markets in New York and London and to consumers around the world. It was the home to the meatpacking industry. It was America's butcher. 4 out of 5 butcher firms were in Chicago. And they also attracted a lot of immigrants. It helped urbanize Chicago. Between 1866 and 1886, millions of cattle was driven from Texas to railroad hubs to be shipped to Chicago. And then in Chicago, it would go through the disassembly lines and slaughterhouses, and pieces of meat would be put into refrigerated rail cars and sent around the country. Chicago was also the home of other industries like agricultural machinery and steel production. The population boomed. Around 1850, it was 30,000. 1870, it was 300,000. 1900, it was 1.7 million. The Great Chicago Fire of 1871. In this fire, there was around 300 people who were killed. It left 100,000 residents homeless. It started because of a hot, dry, and windy day in the city, and there was lots of wooden construction. Building codes improved after that, and the city quickly built back up. Railroads. Now, railroads created great wealth in the late 1800s. They created the first massive corporations in the United States, and demands by laborers united farmers and immigrants together. The railroads, they linked towns and cities to the rest of the United States that were not linked together before. Between 1865 and 1885, railroad lines tripled. Between 1885 and 1920, they tripled again. The late 1800s saw lots of invention as well. Thomas Edison was an American inventor and a businessman. He's considered by many as America's greatest inventor. His inventions include the phonograph, motion picture camera, early versions of electric light, bulb, and much, much more. So in 1873, he commercialized electrical power and lighting. Now, the invention of the light bulb. Before the advent of the light bulb, candles and oil lamps were used to light the cities. In 1880, Thomas Edison founded the Edison Electric Illuminating Company of New York. He started with some financial contributions from the tycoon J.P. Morgan, and the company created the first electrical generating stations that would power electrical systems in newly patented light bulbs. Edison did not invent the light bulb. He created the first commercially practical light bulb. Nikola Tesla was a Serbian-American who invented the first alternating current AC motor and AC generation in transmission technology. The AC system he invented remains the global standard for power transmission to this day. And he was a competitor with Thomas Edison. In fact, he used to work with Thomas Edison. Tesla was unable to capitalize on his inventions, and he died in poverty. In his old age, he grew ill, and he became obsessed with the number 3 and meticulously washing. He also spent his last years feeding and communicating with pigeons. In this picture, we see Mark Twain, who was a friend of Nikola Tesla. Now, immigration was also rapid in the late 1800s. Industrialization and opportunities attracted immigrants to the United States. The population continued to grow in the late 1800s due to this pull effect. Many immigrants went to cities which helped the cities grow. So cities like New York or Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Milwaukee, St. Louis. Between 60 to 90% of many cities were immigrants. And immigrants came to the United States in different waves throughout American history. So if you look at this graph, during the colonial era, which is not on the graph, there was a wave of immigration from Northern Europe. In the 1820s and 1840s, which is on this graph, there's a wave of immigration from places like Ireland and the Germanic area. In the late 1800s, which we're talking about in this presentation, to the early 1900s, there was immigration from Italy, Russia, Hungary, Scandinavia, Poland, Eastern Europe, and many, many different places. After World War II, there's a wave of immigrants from Germany. And in recent history, there's a wave of immigrants from Mexico and China and different countries. Now, if you look at this graph, it looks like the biggest wave is the most recent wave between the 1980s and 2000s, but this is not a percentage of the population. If it was, it would be in the late 1800s. Now, why did people go to the United States in the 1800s or late 1800s or even before that? Well, there are push and pull factors. So a push factor is one that they were pushed out of their country. And a pull factor is a reason that they wanted to go to the United States. So some push factors was religious persecution, civil unrest in their home country, and they couldn't find work. A pull factor would they would go to the United States because of fertile land, a new start, a sanctuary from the unrest in their country, factory work, and to make money and to send it home. And many immigrants went through Ellis Island, which is near the Statue of Liberty in New York. So it's a federally owned island, and it's between New York and New Jersey in the New York Harbor. It was the busiest immigration inspection station in the United States. Between 1892 and 1924, around 12 million immigrants passed through Ellis Island. It was a gateway for immigrants to a new American life. Before Ellis Island, it was mostly up to the states to decide on what immigrants were allowed into their states. Now, immigration would bring lots of different people from different backgrounds. So some immigrants stayed in the U.S. and they made some money and then went back to their home country. Immigrants who stayed either assimilated into the American culture, which is always developing, or they retained their traditional culture and, of course, brought their culture with them. Ethnic neighborhoods formed, and the politics of cities was very much influenced by immigrants. In the late 1800s, political machines were a driving force in the cities. So the machines have been around since the 1790s, and they stayed till about the 1960s, but it was in the late 1800s that they became the most powerful. Political machines in cities like Boston, Chicago, St. Louis, Kansas, New York, Philadelphia were very influential and very prominent. They had this idea of bossism, which emerged at this time in the Gilded Age, the late 1800s. And bossism was simply a system of political control where the boss had the power. And he was at the center, and he controlled a complex organization of lesser figures, which was the machine. And people would help the boss or would help the machine, and they would help other people. And they gave lots of immigrants opportunities. So many immigrants were attracted to political machines and gave them a life of their own. And there was a lot of corruption in these political machines, but with this money, they often built schools or public services like gas lines and hospitals and whatnot. And in Manhattan, in New York, Tammany Hall, the local political machine there, they built Central Park. Now, let's talk a little bit about the New South. Now, remember, this is after the Civil War and towards the end of the Reconstruction and thereafter. Many Southerners felt the South was dead after the Civil War, right? Before it was agricultural. Now the whole country's becoming more industrialized, especially the South, which was not used to the industrialized way of life like the North was. And they had accepted this new way of life. And new capital and Southern labor from the poor black people and poor white people would help build the South. But in reality, the New South was very much like the Old South in many ways because of discrimination, because of organized terror, because of corruption, economic exploitation, and violent intimidation. So the New South promoters concentrated on building infrastructure because everything was destroyed after the Civil War. It would take many years and decades to rebuild. So railroads, roads, and other infrastructure people concentrated on building. More manufacturing industries developed, like textiles and furniture and steel. You know, before it was mostly just cotton, tobacco, and cotton and tobacco would stay, but it would the nature of the industry would obviously change with slavery ending. There was better paying jobs for some people, but they usually went to the white people, and poor black citizens. They were often poorer than the white citizens. So between Reconstruction era and World War II, the New South industrialized, but it still didn't industrialize as much as the North. Now, there was rampant amounts of discrimination, and there was the Jim Crow laws, and the Jim Crow laws was segregation. So discrimination was prevalent in the South. Black votes were suppressed since the Reconstruction era. So white people would stuff the ballots, and they would also intimidate black voters. Between 1890 and 1908, there was legal disenfranchisement. Laws passed requiring voters to pass literacy tests, which were often judged arbitrarily, and pay poll taxes. So this affected the black population. If, for example, if there was a poor white man and a poor black man, and they would have to read a local constitution, if neither one could read it properly enough to be allowed to vote, often the local government in the South would allow the white man to vote, say his was good enough and not the black man. So Jim Crow laws were legal segregation in public and private life. There's also something in the South in the late 1800s, after the Civil War and Reconstruction era, around that time. It's called the Lost Cause. And in the South, many people glorified the Old South, right? So they had this mythic past of happy slaves and generous masters and chivalric men and faithful Southern belles. So many argue that the secession, which started the Civil War, wasn't for slavery, but for home and honor. But this was mostly mythical. Now, gender and religion and culture in the late 1800s. So people questioned gender roles even more in the late 1800s, and they questioned religious values, and they questioned morality. So culture changed, as it always does. There's also advancements in technology and new forms of entertainment. Urbanization, immigration, scientific and technological advancements, consumption patterns, availability of more consumer goods, and awareness of economic, racial, and gender inequalities. These all challenge gender roles. There was evolving cultural and social values that challenged old traditional roles, and women were fighting for their right to vote and right to work, and their fashion changed. There was also premarital sexual exploration. The women also led a temperance movement to try to stop drinking and to promote feminine virtue and Christian sentiment. And at the same time, men were worried that they were losing their masculinity, because before, most men were working hard labor jobs, and now many are still in the late 1800s, but more working behind a desk. In the late 1800s, during the industrialization of the United States, churches worried that the church was becoming too feminized, and this is when gender roles are slowly changing. A famous priest once said that the masculine Jesus had been made mushy and sweetly effeminate. Another one said a preponderance of female influence in the church or anywhere else in society is unnatural and injurious. There's also something known as muscular Christianity, and people wanted to bring that muscular side to men out, and they founded clubs like the Woodcraft Indians or the Sons of Daniel Boone or the Boys Brigade, and these were precursors to what would become the Boy Scouts. And at this time, sports like basketball and volleyball were invented. So both these sports were created by instructors at the Young Men's Christian Association, that's the YMCA. So basketball was created in 1891 by Dr. James Naismith, who was an instructor at the YMCA. Given the task to find a way to help athletes stay in shape inside during the winter, and he created basketball. And just a few years later, in 1895, William G. Morgan created volleyball. Vaudeville shows was a form of entertainment in the late 1800s. So they actually started in the Civil War era, and it became very popular in the late 1880s. So these traveling shows included musicians, dancers, comedians, trained animals, magicians, muscle men, ventriloquists, acrobats, jugglers, one-act plays, and much more. These shows were short, and they were a quirky form of entertainment. They were family friendly, but they did include racial stereotypes of African Americans and recent immigrants. Now, somebody who got their start in a vaudeville show was a man named Harry Houdini. So he was a Hungarian-born American. He became famous from the shows, and his stage name was Harry Handcuff Houdini. He was an illusionist, a magician, a stunt performer, and an escape artist. Some of his greatest performances include chained in handcuffs and leg irons and put inside a beats the whale for 15 minutes, and then he escaped. He also once swallowed 100 needles and 20 yards of thread with a drink of water. Showing his empty mouth to the audience, he reached inside his mouth and pulled out every single needle, fully threaded together. He was also buried alive 6 feet under without a casket. Houdini became unconscious and almost died. He had to be pulled up by him. In the 1880s, the invention of the motion picture camera that could photograph a rapid sequence of images using one lens, it allowed several minutes of action to be captured and stored on a film reel. By 1884, Edison Manufacturing Company produced 75 short films that would be viewed through a small eyepiece. By 1889, the first phonograph parlor in San Francisco was available, and you could pay 5 cents to listen to music. Thank you for listening. If you're interested in some PowerPoints or some activities for the Gilded Age or the industrialization of the United States and American history, or many other topics from the Progressive Era to the World Wars to the recent past, please check out the Lessons in Humanity store. The link to the store is in the description below.